I've been daily driving EndeavourOS for about 5 months now, and I'm not switching back. So like a true Linux vegan, I'm now contractually obligated to tell you about it. So buckle up, this is going to be a long one. So before we get into the meat and potatoes, let me explain why I even left Windows in the first place. For a long time, I wasn't happy with Windows. I was just tolerating it, from ads in the start menu, LARPing as suggestions, to having to molest my install in order to rip out any bloatware and telemetry. It wasn't until I had purchased the Steam Deck that I had gotten my first taste of Linux gaming, and it sort of clicked to me that gaming on Linux might not be a total meme. The tipping point for me was experiencing the Nvidia black screen bug earlier in 2025. Now, some of you might know what I'm talking about, but for those of you who don't, let me explain. So what would happen is whenever I would finish playing a game and close it out, there would be about a 10% chance that everything would behave normally for about 10 to 15 seconds, and then all three of my monitors would simultaneously lose their display signal and go black. Trying to use the keybind to restart my GPU drivers didn't work, and downgrading my drivers to a previous version didn't work either. Now, the only solution that actually worked was restarting my PC, and when playing a game on your computer turns it into a slot machine where the prize is a frozen computer, that's no longer a minor bug. So I said, screw it, the drivers on Linux must be good enough because there are already people with Nvidia cards playing games there. And it turns out, they are. Now, this isn't the first time I've tried Linux on this system. I've installed Fedora, Arch Linux, and CachyOS, but ended up settling on Endeavour since it's basically Arch Linux with a graphical installer, and it doesn't throw as many extra utilities and programs at you like CachyOS does. Now, as for the day-to-day, web browsing and listening to music, sending emails and whatnot all work just fine. Even Discord works, but screen sharing, at least on my system, doesn't work in the official client, and I have to use something like Desktop where it does work. But from my understanding, on the AMD side of things, Discord has gotten that sorted, so hopefully those fixes eventually make their way over to the Nvidia side. As for the desktop environment I settled on, I originally started off using KDE Plasma, but ended up moving over to Hyperlin as I didn't like just how much bloat or dependencies all of these KDE packages came with. And a good example of this actually is I use GDM, which is GNOME's display manager, and when you install that, it pulls in the GNOME session, even though I would never even be logging into it. Sorry for the interruption, but this is one of those small things about Linux that will make sense after you run into it and it pisses you off. So during the production of this video, I actually ended up switching back to KDE Plasma, not because Hyperlim was bad or anything, but because KDE lets me explicitly define a primary monitor. Now, why might this matter? Let me explain. So here was the problem I was running into. Some games, especially games launched through Steam, would just spawn on whatever monitor my mouse happened to be on, and if that wasn't my main display, it would also take on the resolution of that monitor and I would have to finagle around in the settings to get that fixed. Or some games would launch on my main monitor, but then assume that my leftmost monitor is my primary display and take on that resolution. Again, would require me to either relaunch the game or finagle around in the settings to get it fixed. And while that behavior may sound random, it isn't. It comes from something called X-Wayland. So here's the quick rundown. For a long time, Linux desktops used X11, or the X window system. X11 is old, but it's extremely compatible, and one thing that it does have is a very clear idea of what your primary monitor is. Now, Wayland is the modern replacement to X11. It's faster, more secure, and designed for the modern desktop, but it intentionally does not define a global primary monitor in the same way that X11 does. Instead, that decision is left up to the individual Wayland compositor or desktop environment. And this is where things get messy. So most games and older apps aren't Wayland native yet. They still think that they're running in X11. Now, for games running inside of Proton, you can force them to run natively in Wayland with this launch command, though it is hit or miss and depends on the game, as sometimes it may lead to unexpected bugs. So when you launch an X11 app in a Wayland session, they're actually running through X-Wayland, which is a compatibility layer that translates X11 apps so that they can run on Wayland. The problem is X11 apps still expect X11 style rules like a primary monitor, but Wayland compositors all handle that differently. In KDE Plasma, there's a setting where you can explicitly say this is my primary display, and KDE will pass that information along in a way that X-Wayland apps understand, so Steam games will consistently open on the correct monitor no matter where your mouse might be. In compositors like Hyperlin, there isn't exactly a universal standard for that yet, so some compositors may guess, or in Hyperlin's case, it just follows your cursor position unless you set a window rule. So I didn't switch back to KDE just because Hyperlin is bad or anything. Actually, it's a very good window manager. Right now, KDE just handles X-Wayland in a way that better suits my use case. Anyways, back to the video. Now, surprisingly, Arch Linux does not have as much of a learning curve as people online would make you think. The Arch Wiki is actually very well documented and has many pages covering specific programs that will practically give you a step-by-step instruction on how to configure them. Now, the only downside for my fellow Zoomers out there is you've got to read. Now, for issues not covered in the Arch Wiki, you're going to have to touch some virtual grass and go talk to another Linux user, whether it's on Reddit or in one of the many Discord communities centered around Linux. More than likely, someone has experienced the same issue as you and knows how to fix it. It also helps to come into Linux with a fresh mind and to keep in mind that this is a completely different operating system, so it's not going to behave like Windows, and you are going to have to relearn how to use a computer to a certain degree. The only concept I really had trouble wrapping my head around at first was the entire Unix idea of everything being a folder. For example, in Windows, you might be used to your drives being represented by a letter like the C drive or the F drive, while on Linux, your drives are folders that just live inside of /mnt, and a flash drive or any other temporarily mounted media would live inside of run/media. Once you understand the file system hierarchy and on the gaming side, especially how wine and proton prefixes work, everything just kind of clicks. So the next thing I had to get used to was how you install applications on Linux. So unlike Windows, where you would just go and Google an application, go over to their website, download an executable, and then run an install wizard, on Linux, you have a couple of options. The first option being a graphical-based store application. So something like the KDE Discover Store. You would just search up the application you're looking for, hit the install button, and it installs without you ever having to touch a terminal. And the second option is interacting with your package manager directly via the terminal. And this is the option I personally prefer just because I find it a lot faster to just open up a terminal and type a command than it is to go open up the Discover Store. Now, in regards to stability, a lot of people online seem to be under the assumption that if you look at Arch Linux the wrong way, it will implode on itself and blow up. In my 5-ish months of daily driving Endeavor, I've never had an update break my system. I've never had to reinstall, and I've never been locked out of my desktop. The worst issue I've personally run into was a bug in an NVIDIA driver that caused one of my secondary monitors to be stuck at the wrong resolution, and the fix for that was just to downgrade the driver and wait for another release. Now, this isn't me saying that breakage never happens on Arch Linux, but in my own personal use, it's been far less dramatic than what people on the internet make it out to be. Alright, let's talk about hardware support, and I'm going to address the elephant in the room right off rip, that being NVIDIA. If you're running an NVIDIA GPU on Linux, the biggest issue you're likely to run into today is DirectX 12. So games that use DirectX 12 and run through Proton can take a noticeable performance hit. That's anywhere from 10 to 30% depending on the game. So the good news is this is no longer some sort of mysterious unsolved problem, and a root cause has been identified and they're working on a fix. The bad news is we don't really know when that fix is coming. So this is something that you should be fully aware of if you are using an NVIDIA GPU and thinking about coming over to Linux. More broadly speaking, NVIDIA users on Linux, for better or worse, are kind of second-class citizens compared to AMD users, and that's mostly because the NVIDIA driver stack is still proprietary, which makes any sort of deep integration with Linux a lot slower and more painful than with the open-source Mesa driver stack that AMD and Intel GPUs use. A good example of this is Waydroid, the Android emulator. On AMD and Intel GPUs, you get proper hardware acceleration. On NVIDIA, you get no GPU acceleration at all, so if you were hoping to play Android games on your desktop, that's basically a non-starter. Another example is the Sway window manager, which explicitly states that NVIDIA hardware is unsupported and bug reports from NVIDIA users won't be accepted. Now, this isn't the developer being mean or malicious, that's just the developer being real. If there's a bug in Mesa, you can submit a bug report, or if you have the skill, you can submit code. If there's a bug in the NVIDIA driver, all you can do is submit a bug report and hope that an NVIDIA employee decides to take on that bug. That being said, it's not all doom and gloom. One thing that genuinely surprised me is how much random hardware just works on Linux. A few examples are I can configure the screen on my NZXT Kraken using an application called Cooler Control. I can control all of the RGB lights in my PC using OpenRGB, and I can even track the battery life on my headphones from a Tray app, which is something that I couldn't even do on Windows, and I would have to open up the official manufacturer's software to check. So while GPU support on the NVIDIA side still has some rough edges, overall hardware support on Linux in 2025 was much better than I expected, and in some cases, straight up better than Windows. Alright, now for what most of you have been waiting for, which is gaming. Now, before I begin, I want to be very clear up front that if you primarily play games like Fortnite, Rainbow Six Siege, GTA Online, Call of Duty, or Battlefield, you realistically have two options if you're switching to Linux. You can either dual boot Windows, or you can give those games up. Those titles all use anti-cheat systems that require kernel level access on Windows and simply don't support Linux. Now, that isn't some sort of issue with with Linux, it's just a policy decision made by those developers. Now, if you want to check whether or not your favorite multiplayer game supports Linux, I highly recommend you check out a site called Are We Anti-Cheat Yet? It breaks down exactly what games work, which ones don't, and why. Now, for everything outside of that category, gaming on Linux has honestly been a breeze. I don't even bother checking ProtonDB anymore for new releases because every game I've bought in this year has either been Linux native or runs through Proton with zero issues. Valve, alongside the open source community, have put in an insane amount of work into making Linux gaming feel painless. Now, for games outside of Steam, you have a few options. For Epic, GOG, and Amazon games, they all work great through the Heroic Games Launcher, which lets you log into these accounts and you can view your library all in one single place and install games from there as well. And for launchers like Ubisoft Connect or Battle.net, you can either use tools like the Fargus launcher or Lutris, or you can do what I personally do and just add them in as non-Steam games. And on the emulation front, Linux has been fantastic. I was already using EmuDeck on the Steam Deck, so when I found out that it also works on desktop Linux, it was basically a no-brainer. So after 5 months of daily driving EndeavourOS, I can confidently say I'm not switching back. Not because Linux is perfect, it definitely isn't, but at least for my hardware and my workflow and the games I play, it's definitely been a better experience overall compared to Windows. Now, Linux didn't magically fix everything. What it did do is make computing interesting again, as it feels more like I'm using my computer and my computer isn't just using me as a means to collect data, phone it home, and then sell it over to data brokers. Now, if you're perfectly happy on Windows, that's totally fine. This isn't me telling you to change up your workflow or completely uproot what already works for you. But if you aren't happy, Linux in 2025 is definitely a lot more viable than some people would think. Now, before we wrap up, I just wanted to end with a rapid fire list of things I'd do differently and some tips that I'd give people who might be thinking about jumping into Arch or an Arch-based distribution. Now, for things I do differently, there's really only one thing, and that is I would use BTRFS on my root drive instead of ext4. And for any Linux veterans who might be watching this video, you probably know exactly what I'm about to say. Taking snapshots on BTRFS is instant, and the extra benefit of using BTRFS is that you can boot directly into those snapshots if you were to ever break your system. Unfortunately, on ext4, you can't do that. As for advice I'd give to a new Arch Linux user, first things first, read the Arch Wiki. I know that reading the manual is a meme, but seriously, it will answer like 80% of the questions you might have if that specific piece of software has an Arch Wiki page. The next one is don't blindly copy paste commands that you don't understand. I understand a lot of people nowadays may be using LLMs like ChatGPT to help them troubleshoot their Linux computers. Just make sure you have an idea of what the LLM is telling you to do before you just copy and paste it into a terminal. The next one is when you update your computer, just get into the habit of making note of what got upgraded, just in case when you reboot, if something ends up breaking, you already have an idea of who the culprit might be and who might need to get downgraded. And the final one, and while I originally thought I should make this into an entire section in the video, this video was already getting a bit long, try to limit your usage of the AUR, especially if you're a new user, as there's already been cases this year where people have slipped malware onto the AUR, and more than likely if you're brand new to Arch Linux, you probably don't know how to read a package build. So the absolute super quick rundown on reading a package build, generally you're just going to want to be looking for where the contents of that package are being sourced from. Typically it's going to be like a GitHub URL. It'll get shown to you in your terminal and you'll just want to follow that link and scope out that GitHub page. Make sure it looks legit. Mental Outlaw actually made a very good video going over how to read a package build. I recommend you check it out before downloading anything off of the AUR. And if you've made it this far into the video, thank you for watching. And if you liked it, hit that like button, leave a comment as it does help me out in the algorithm. I'll catch you guys the next time I have something to yap about.